Hey Year 12s, today we're discussing the imaginative landscape. If this isn't your context or you're not confident about what the task of context involves, stop. Go watch our videos on context in general or on your own context. There are 4 possible texts you could be studying for imaginative landscape, each of which you'll find specific pages and videos for on here. But first you need to understand the big ideas of the context, which we will be discussing in this video. First, what is the imaginative landscape? When interpreting this concept, keep in mind that landscape does not simply refer to the countryside or an ocean view, but can mean the emotional or cultural landscape of a room or even an item. By adding imaginative to this word, the phrase is now directing the scope of the discussion explicitly away from the physical landscapes and towards internal conceptualizations of place. It is important to always keep in mind the relationship between the external and internal worlds when discussing imaginative landscapes. Remember that we do not simply see something and absorb it without adding our own interpretation. Instead, we experience the world around us from our specific viewpoint as an individual and transform this into something that makes sense to us within our minds. We'll talk more about this in a second. Therefore, together, the words of this prompt ask us to consider the ways that humans interact with and interpret the world around them. Okay, on to our first big idea. Landscape is subjective. This means that, fundamentally, no two people can experience landscape in the same way. Even if we are to accept that, philosophically, some things are objective, landscape remains a subjective idea. For example, you and I can objectively agree that this thing behind me is a painting, but what we both see when we look at it is entirely different. We might not agree on whether it's good or not. On top of that, I associate this painting with being at work and on camera. You probably associate it with engaged videos and having internet tabs open. Because we come to the interpretation table with different experiences, jobs, ages and so forth, our interpretation is different. Just a few factors to consider that influence our subjective view of the world are our past experiences, including our childhood, our religion and values, our culture, nationality and racial identity, our age and maturity, and our educational level, intelligence or job, and so forth. The subjective nature of connection to landscape means that there is a somewhat of a barrier in the dialogue we have about landscape. This gives way to phrases such as, "a picture means 1,000 words," because we simply cannot express to another person what sort of effect such a view would have. Sharing personal experiences of landscape is made somewhat shallow, regardless if the person we share it with was there at the same time as us. They are still a different person at a different place in their life, and could never have taken the same emotions and associations away from that place. Our second big idea today is that human connection to landscape is profound, meaning that it is deep, complex, and important. This idea can manifest itself in several different ways. First and foremost, imaginative landscape prompts can reflect on the deep internal connection that exists between humans and the spaces around them, whether this refers to natural spaces or otherwise. This idea can also be related to prompts that revolve around how landscapes influence the way we think. The space around us is undeniably important in the formation of our worldview, but it can also be seen to influence our sense of identity or belonging, our sense of ourselves and those around us. Landscapes can have an effect on our emotional states, both positively and negatively. A landscape that evokes a particular emotion in its inhabitants is reflective of the power of human connection to space. But remember, this reaction will not necessarily be the same from person to person. For example, a girl and boy meet at university while on exchange and fall in love. After they graduate, the boy moves back to his hometown in Italy and the girl follows him. The boy is at peace. He is in an accommodating, familiar landscape that he feels comfortable in. On the other hand, the girl finds herself in a hostile landscape. No one speaks her language and she feels isolated in the crowded streets, which is so unlike the landscape of her childhood. In this way, landscapes can shift the emotional states of inhabitants based on their connection or disassociation from that place. This example links to our next big idea, the question of whether or not landscapes can be positive or negative. It can be said that no landscape is neutral, because we naturally invest any place with our personal feelings and impressions. There will always be certain ideas, experiences, and emotions associated with any given place. Even if a person is to move through a landscape without really taking notice of it, it is then this disassociation or disconnect with the space around them that generates meaning. Perhaps even this meaning will grow more significant with time as new realizations are brought to surface about place and our personal connection with it. Many things can make a landscape positive or negative for an individual, keeping in mind that this is inherently subjective. Foreignness and familiarity are often governing factors for whether or not a person interprets it positively. This in turn has an influence on the person experiencing the landscape, how they behave and how they think. Of course, this response is subject to change and reinterpretation. Next, let's consider the big idea of changing landscapes. There are a lot of ways that landscapes can change. Let's discuss 3 big ones. It's important to understand all of them so you can interpret prompts as broadly as possible. Physical change. Landscape can physically change because of natural disasters such as earthquakes and cyclones, or simply gradual shifts over time. Some change in cyclic way, such as a beach which washes itself clean, or the Australian bush which changes wildly between wet and dry seasons. This form of change is particularly complex when it is humans that cause the change, such as an oil spill or natural disasters brought on by climate change. Interpretive change. As people change, so too does their interpretation of landscape, even if that place has not physically changed. As we grow and mature, our worldview changes, and so our sense of place will alter. For example, as a child, a girl despised visits to her grandmother's house. Now that she is older and more mature, she feels totally connected to that house. The death of her grandmother makes the space even more important to her sense of self, demonstrating how events can alter our perception of place. The space remains the same, but how she sees it changes. As a person ages, they can transform a landscape of their memory, allowing it to have new meaning with the wisdom they gain from age or the new perception they develop of people or experiences associated with that place. Changing locations. Unlike many species, and our ancestors, modern humans are capable of completely uprooting and moving to another place. When we physically shift places, so too does our connection with the world around us. Think of all the people who have moved between the country and the city and how different these landscapes are. Those of you who have lived in more than one country have a head start here and may want to consider writing on that experience where possible. Our next big idea is one that can be a little hard to get your head around, but luckily doesn't tend to be a big consideration. That is, how humans see themselves reflected in the landscape. Because we are so interlinked with landscape, humans often see themselves, or aspects of humanity, reflected in the spaces around them. This feeling is reflected in advertising and writing. For example, a popular representation of human tenacity and resilience is a small green shoot springing forth from the ashes of a bushfire. Authors will often give human qualities to inanimate objects or anthropomorphize animals, not only to add to their description, but to speak to this sense in people. We see this stuff every day, the weather reflecting a character's mood in a movie, or your parents saying that the dog is smiling when really he's just panting. Alright, last one, I promise. Let's discuss the relationship between the internal and external landscapes. There is a distinct link between the internal and the external landscape, a relationship that goes both ways. Not only does the space around us influence the landscape we hold within us, the opposite is also true. The creation of an internal landscape is highly personal and relative to the individual. Nonetheless, it is true of many people that the landscapes we hold within us is dependent on landscapes of our memory and places we have found a positive connection to. Someone who is having trouble adjusting to the vast emptiness of the Australian bush may develop an internal landscape based around images and sensations specific to a city environment. Equally, someone who feels disconnected with or frightened by the environment they inhabit may begin to emotionally inhabit a place that is exactly opposite from the situation in which they live. Imaginative landscape requires students to examine the way these two spaces, physical and emotional, influence one another throughout a person's life. Alright, that's a lot of big ideas to think about. To help reinforce it, read the text on this page, which includes different but similar examples and information to what we've just talked through. Turn this into a set of notes for yourself and work to integrate your text knowledge into this information. Thanks for watching and happy writing.